Today we're going to be taking a look at what I consider to be the strangest and most baffling chess move that Bobby Fischer has ever made. And it's a move which set into motion a chain of events that led to the greatest victory of his entire career. Now, Bobby Fischer has done some strange things in his life, both on and off the chessboard, but in this first game we're going to be looking at, he makes a decision that is so unfathomable that even to this day, no one knows for sure exactly what was going through his head, although there has been some educated speculation, which we are of course going to get into. Now, the move in question comes from the very first game of the highly anticipated 1972 World Chess Championship. And for those of you familiar with this match, the move I'm talking about might already be pretty obvious. But stick around, because I'm going to reveal some things about this move that you may not know. So let's get right into this game. Bobby Fischer is playing black, and his opponent, the sitting world champion Boris Spassky, opens with d4. Fischer responds knight to f6, and after c4 from Spassky, Fischer doesn't go with his signature King's Indian, but instead opts for e6, heading into a Queen's Gambit declined scenario with this three knights variation as it's called, at which point Fischer plays bishop to b4, the Rogozin variation, pinning the knight and playing for control of that e4 square. Now, this is an opening that Bobby hadn't played for about 10 years, so he's clearly trying to be unpredictable. He doesn't want to run into any opening preparation from Boris Spassky and his team of trainers. And having already made himself intimately familiar with every game of Spassky's that he could possibly get his hands on, I have no doubt that Fischer anticipated this rather tame move, e3, which Spassky had been known to play before, blocking in his dark squared bishop, but it's a fine move and still popular today, though playing bishop to g5, getting that bishop outside the pawn chain first, is a bit more common. From here we get some moves that are quite predictable, no surprises, some piece development. Fischer is delaying playing knight to c6, so he can hit the center first with c5, Spassky castles, and now knight to c6. a3 puts a question to Fischer's bishop, to which he responds bishop to a5, choosing to keep his bishop pair as opposed to doubling white's pawns, and the little lead in development that results after this move bishop takes c3, which is the most popular move played today. But Fischer does love his bishops, and it is indeed this very dark squared bishop that will end up making the most important move of this game. Spassky now plays knight to e2. He's now threatening d takes c5, followed by a quick b4, defending that pawn, which wouldn't have worked with his knight sitting on c3, since black can just capture there at will, forcing b takes c3, and so eliminating the possibility of playing that pawn to b4. Fischer now captures on c4, before Spassky has the chance to get that pawn to b3, where it can recapture, keeping some control of the d5 square. And so here the bishop must make the recapture. Bishop to b6 now defends c5, which is now captured by Spassky. Fischer throws in this queen trade, and then makes the recapture with bishop takes c5. And so, with the queens off the board and a nearly symmetrical structure, a draw is looking very likely. And I think it's a result that Fischer would have been totally fine with, especially in this critical first game where he has the black pieces. Spassky continues b4. It's a great move, comes with tempo on the bishop, opens up that nice diagonal for the dark squared bishop. So Fischer retreats the bishop to its best square, which you might think looks a little bit passive, but he is anticipating Spassky's response, bishop to b2, after which he can play bishop to d7 without losing a piece to bishop takes f6, since after bishop takes f6 and rook takes d7, the rook on a1 would fall, and black would be up the exchange. And this move, bishop to d7, is actually the first deviation from a game that Spassky played in 1958 in the USSR Championship against a strong player named Nikolai Krogius, who later became a grandmaster, and who in this position opted for b6 and bishop to b7, instead of this move bishop to d7, which was probably part of Fischer's preparation. Maybe he thought it was an improvement over b6, although the engine doesn't see a huge difference between these two moves. Rook a to c1 now from Spassky. Bishop takes f6, followed by rook takes d7 is now a threat. Fischer defends with rook f to d8. A knight jumps into the center. A pair of knights come off the board. Bishop to a4 attacks the rook. Spassky blocks with the bishop. He, of course, wants to keep that rook on the open file. The light squared bishops are traded. a pair of rooks come off the board. And at this point, if you haven't seen this game, you might be wondering how such a lifeless position could ever lead to one of the most memorable moves that Bobby Fischer has ever made. I mean, there's just nothing here. But Fischer continues rook to c8. Spassky moves his king towards the center. Fischer does the same. He knows that rook to c2 goes nowhere. White can just play rook to d2, or even bishop takes f6 followed by rook to d7. Next is king to e2 and knight to e4. Now threatening to come into c2. Since d2 is covered, there's no rook to d2. So Spassky plays rook to c1. The last of the heavy pieces come off the board, which is what everyone watching this game was probably starting to become. Looks like a draw is a done deal, but the moves keep coming. f6 from Fischer, not exactly sure why that was played. It doesn't seem to do anything too important, maybe sort of a waiting move. Knight to a5, this attacks b7. Knight to d6 defends. Spassky moves his king further towards the center. Standard endgame procedure. Bishop to d8 from Fischer, looking to get his bishop a bit more active. Eyeing that knight, which now moves to c4. Attacking the knight on d6. Bishop to c7 defends. The knights are traded, leaving only the bishops, in a position so sterile that it makes a mule look like a rabbit. b5 now played by Spassky, which doesn't seem to do much besides place a pawn in the opposite colored square from his bishop, which is what you're supposed to do in these endings. He's probably planning a4 next, completely unaware that the game is about to get a lot more interesting after the move that Fischer plays next, which is a move that very few chess players would even consider. It's a move that beginners know not to make. It confounded all the top players who just couldn't fathom how in this position Bobby Fischer thought it was a good idea to play bishop takes h2, greedily grabbing that undefended pawn with his bishop. And if you don't immediately know what is the problem with this move, maybe you're relatively new to the game of chess, go ahead and pause the video and take a look at this position. There is a good chance that you'll find the move that Spassky played next. And that move is g3, closing the diagonal and trapping that bishop. Now the white king can simply make its way to g2, and how are you saving that bishop? For Bobby Fischer to fall for something so elementary seemed so unthinkable that Grandmaster Edgar Mednis later remarked, quote, "I couldn't believe that Fischer was capable of such an error. How is such an error possible from a top master or from any master?" Unquote. So what happened? Did the possibility of white playing g3 just totally escape the great Bobby Fischer? Well, as you might suspect, there is more to it than that. Because of how far the white king actually is from g2, black can almost save his bishop. Additionally, the position of the white bishop is relevant. For example, if it were on b2 instead of c1, then the black bishop could escape. A fact that is not exactly obvious. So what was Fischer seeing after this move g3? Well, he begins with h5. He's going to attack g3. Spassky's king approaches, and now h4 by Fischer, offering his h-pawn so that his bishop can escape. But of course Spassky declines. He wants the bishop, but he's got to be very careful here. He's got a choice to make now. King to f1 or king to f3. Only one of these two moves is any good. So take a moment and try to determine which move is best if you don't already know, but here it comes. The move Spassky played was king to f3. Headed for g2, of course. It's the only good move, but what's wrong with king to f1? Well, here h3 is actually winning for black, creating a passed pawn and a wall shutting out the white king. You can see these three squares are covered, the pawn and the bishop working together, and as long as this pawn's sitting on h3, the white king will have babysitting duty. He can't go very far, or the bishop will go to g1 and guide the pawn in. And how are you ever going to win this pawn? Get the king to g4? Black can easily stop that with f5. Not to mention the threat of bishop takes g3 followed by h2 if the king ever goes to e2. That's a problem. Now, if white could get his bishop to g1 and trade, that would be good, but it's going to require moving the f-pawn, in which case g3 falls. So if there even is some way for white to untangle himself over here on the king side, it's going to be much too slow. And in the meantime, it's going to be the white bishop versus the black king on the rest of the board, which is a battle that white will not win. So you got to hand it to Fischer for at least creating the possibility for Spassky to blunder in an apparently lifeless position, But is it worth it to gamble like this? Was it really worth taking the risk that in this position, Spassky would find the correct move, king to f3, which of course he did? Well, it's not as crazy as you might think, because in this position, black actually still has a draw. Though securing that draw is not nearly as simple as Fischer thought it was when he played this bishop takes h2. So let's see why, starting with the obvious. H takes g3 can be met with f takes g3, the white king plays to g2 next, trapping the bishop. So what about h3? This is what was speculated to be the move that Bobby Fischer had originally planned. It allows the white king to win the h-pawn with king to g4, but black has bishop to g1, attacking f2, threatening h2 and h1, so king takes h3 is forced, black captures on f2, and here it's assumed that Fischer thought his bishop would escape via e1. Unfortunately though, white has bishop to d2. This is what Fischer most likely missed. Again, the bishop is trapped, and it will be won with king to g2. And this only works because the bishop on d2 guards both e1 and e3. So as you can see, the winning of Fischer's bishop is not quite as simple as it may have initially appeared. And while it is surprising that Fischer missed this move bishop to d2, it's not unfathomable. But this is not what happened in the game. In this position, Bobby Fischer, apparently realizing that there was no saving his bishop, just played king to e7. It's a good move. He's waiting for king to g2, now played by Spassky, after which he trades that h-pawn with h takes g3, and after f takes g3, his trapped bishop captures on g3, giving Fischer 2 pawns for the sacrificed piece. And for many years, it was thought that black is probably lost here. However, modern-day chess engines have rewritten chess history, as they have done in many other games, and have shown that black can actually survive with correct play. Meaning that Fischer's crazy-looking bishop takes h2 was not a blunder after all. Although you can still make the argument that it was a bad move, since with correct play from white, black has no hope of winning and has to play very accurately just to secure the draw. Which Fischer does for a few moves. He plays the correct king to d6, threatening to infiltrate with king to c5, a4 now from Spassky, preparing bishop to a3 if king c5 is played, which will prevent king to b4, and he's planning to loosen up black's kingside pawns with bishop to f8 next. Fischer steps out of the way of that check with king to d5. We have bishop to a3. Fischer attacks e3, bishop to c5 defends, with an attack on the a7 pawn. And in case you're wondering about b6 here for black, that would fail to bishop takes b6, followed by a5, when one of these two white pawns will become a queen. So a6 gets the a pawn out of the view of the bishop there. Spassky responds b6. At which point we have the real blunder of the game. And before I show you the losing move that Fischer plays in this position, let's take a look at how black can secure the draw, starting with the correct move, e5. Now if white wants to win, he's gonna have to grab some pawns. If you try bishop to f8, then the e3 pawn falls. Then if white goes after black's kingside pawns with his bishop, the black king will run over to the queen side, win the b6 pawn, leaving only the pawn on a4, which will not be enough, and it's a drawn position. If instead the king tries to infiltrate with king to g4, then g6 is there to shut out the white king. And how can white make progress? You can't get black into zugzwang with something like a5, since king to d5 comes with an attack on the bishop, and if bishop to e7, black can draw by sacrificing his pawns, like so, then running over to the queen side with his king, and in this position, white will not be able to force his way into c8 to win these pawns with his king without giving black stalemate. So set up this position and play around with it if you like. It's very instructive, but getting back to Fischer's blunder, which in this position was f5 instead of the correct e5, this gives Spassky king to h4. And there is no stopping the white king's infiltration via g5 or h5. Now if black tries to chase the bishop around, starting with king to d5, it will eventually be able to make its way to the g5 square, defending e3 that way. From there, it can easily go to d8 to defend b6. If black were to go after that pawn with the king, white's going to clean up all these queenside pawns, and will win using his extra e-pawn. So Fischer decides to eliminate the e-pawn right away with f4, but after e takes f4 and king takes f4, unlike the previous variation we looked at, black cannot get a draw because even if he gets his king over to d7, he can't keep the white pieces at bay with the threat of stalemate, since here he can always play a5. Unlike the other line we looked at where white had played a5. So once black plays a5, white can go grab that pawn, and it's an easy win from there. So after king to h5, we have king to f5, stopping king to g6, and now bishop to e3. Fischer attacks the bishop, it goes to f2. Fischer has to go back to f5 to prevent king to g6, since if white were allowed to win that g-pawn, then he could even sacrifice his bishop for the e-pawn, and then run over to the queen side with his king and win that way. Bishop to h4 now from Spassky. The e-pawn is pushed. There's really nothing better. Spassky plays a waiting move, bishop to g5, and after e4 and bishop to e3, Fischer is getting close to zugzwang. He tries king to f6, but now king to g4 threatens to win the e-pawn, so king to e5 is played, but after king to g5, there is no saving the g-pawn, which is why Fischer heads towards the queen side. Maybe he can at least pick up that pawn on a4, but at this point, Spassky is more interested in the e-pawn than winning that g-pawn, which is why he now plays king to f5, since this is going to put him closer to the pawn on b7, which is his next target. Fischer continues a5, presumably to fix the pawn on a4, so it can't be pushed, and then defended by the bishop. Bishop to f2 now from Spassky, after which any move Fischer makes will lose a pawn. He plays g5, the king takes, Fischer runs over to win the a-pawn, but after king takes e4, king takes a4 is hopeless. Spassky now goes after the pawn on b7, and after the king gets to d6, Bobby Fischer resigns, seeing that king to c7, followed by king takes b7, and the promotion of the b-pawn is unstoppable, while Fischer's passed a-pawn can be easily stopped by the dark squared bishop. So what a horrific way to have to begin the World Championship, which is something Bobby Fischer had been preparing for his whole life, and which he felt that he ought to win. And this is based on things he has said. For example, before this match began, he said that he didn't consider Spassky to be much of a champion, since Fischer had not competed for the World Championship in 1969 when Spassky won it. So Fischer clearly felt he was the best player in the world, and for good reason. So what is the human thing to do when you are defeated by a weaker player? Well, you start looking for reasons, things to blame, things other than your actual chess ability, and this is what led Fischer to start making his infamous demands. Among other things, he wanted the television cameras to be removed from the playing hall. He said they made too much noise. He wanted the spectators to be moved back. And when his demands were not met to his satisfaction, his decision not to show up for Game 2, which he lost by forfeit, had a profound psychological effect on Spassky, which many people have said was the main goal driving all of Fischer's rather entitled behavior, but I tend to think that Fischer really believed that the tournament conditions were not conducive to him playing his best chess. His attitude seemed to be, I'm the best in the world, everyone already knows it, this match is just a formality, and if it's not exactly how I want it, I'm not playing. And he almost didn't. It has been reported that it took more than one phone call from President Nixon's security advisor Henry Kissinger just to convince him to continue the match. And if you're wondering why the US government cared, well, it was the Cold War and Spassky was Russian. Which brings us to Game 3, which I'm calling the greatest victory of Fischer's entire career. And to appreciate just what an achievement this game is, you have to realize that before this game, Fischer had never beaten Spassky before, but had lost to him a total of 4 times. 5 times if you include his forfeited second game of this match. So he has a terrible record against him. Furthermore, he's now 2 points down in a World Championship match, which is a huge disadvantage. All Spassky has to do now is make as many draws as possible, and he's gonna win. So for Fischer to have that kind of faith in his own ability to continue this match, which he's already proved he has no problem walking away from, and to play this game the way he does, with the black pieces, taking on risks to produce a sharp, imbalanced game, while showing no fear or signs of being tilted by how the match began, it really proves that Fischer was one of the fiercest and most courageous competitors in the whole history of chess, or in any competitive endeavor for that matter. But enough said, I think the stage is properly set. Let's take a look at this game number 3 of the 1972 World Chess Championship. Boris Spassky, again playing white, opens with d4. And we have a repeat of game 1 with identical moves up until this moment where Bobby Fischer plays c5 instead of the d5 that he played in game 1. This is known as the modern Benoni, and it was very popular at the time. It sort of fell out of fashion in the 80s and 90s, but it has been making a bit of a comeback, despite the fact that the chess engines don't really like it, saying that it gives white an advantage with the space-gaining move d5, played now by Spassky, which is the most popular move to this day. A pair of pawns are traded. Fischer plays d6, activating his light-squared bishop. His dark-squared bishop will be developed to g7 after g6, and this is the classic Benoni structure. Black has the queenside pawn majority and some nice control of these dark squares, whereas white gets the central pawn majority and a bit of a space advantage. Additionally, white can often target this pawn on d6 with a knight on c4 and or a bishop on f4. That pawn is of course weak since it can't be defended by another pawn. So the game continues knight to c3 and g6, preparing the fianchetto, and now knight to d2, which looks a bit odd, but the engine thinks it's a good move. It supports e4, and there's also that move knight to c4 at some point, but this move seems a bit early. Playing e4 and bishop to f4 first is more popular. Maybe bishop to g4 was a concern, which would pin that knight in some lines if it stayed on f3. Let me know in the comments if there's some additional opening subtlety that I'm missing here. But anyway, play continues knight b to d7 from Fischer. It might have been a little bit better to wait and see what white does before committing that knight to d7 when there's more obvious moves that black could be playing, like bishop to g7, castling, and then rook to e8. He's blocking his light-squared bishop, and if white were to play a4 to help secure the c4 post for his knight, then maybe knight to a6 would end up being better, targeting that hole on b4. But okay, we have e4, bishop to g7, bishop to e2 now from Spassky, playing against knight to h5, which was a potential way for Fischer to activate his dark-squared bishop, but now it would just lose a pawn to bishop takes h5. So Fischer just castles, so does Spassky. We have rook to e8 and queen to c2, removing the queen's view of h5, which allows Fischer to now do something very interesting, which I don't think Spassky saw coming at all, and that is knight to h5, opening the diagonal for his bishop, but allowing bishop takes h5, played now by Spassky, shattering his kingside pawn structure. Looks absolutely crazy, but that's only because it's genius, and not because it's the best way for black to play. The engine was saying that knight to e5 was better, but Fischer knows that this is going to confuse Spassky, who will probably underestimate the compensation Fischer has for his ruined pawn structure. And sure enough, Spassky does not find the most correct response. The engine says white should keep the knights where they are, defending e4, and is giving a4 as best for white, with ideas of rook to a3, with some lateral attacking potential. But Spassky goes for knight to c4, attacking d6, but now knight to e5 comes with tempo on that knight. If you capture, you're just helping black get his bishop onto a nice attacking square. If you try to kick that bishop with f4, then there's going to be check, followed by f5. Black's getting some nice activity. So Spassky drops his knight back to e3, apparently thinking that his knight has improved its position, and maybe it did. It's watching over the f5 square now, but it did take 2 moves to get there, and now his dark-squared bishop is blocked. And at this point, the position is more or less equal, but only if Fischer plays knight to g4, opening the bishop's eyes and challenging the knight on e3 while you can. It's good for black to get this move in before white plays h3, and then f4, driving that knight back to a more passive square. And it's good to trade this knight for the knight on e3 because it's a potential attacker of black's key weakness on d6. So after knight to g4, the engine's saying if white goes back to c4 with his knight, then black should just play knight to e5 again and keep challenging that knight. But Fischer plays queen to h4 here, planning knight to g4, which would threaten mate in 1, but Spassky could just play f3, and Fischer's attack is really going nowhere. And I'd be curious to know what Fischer had planned after this move f3, which I'm sure he considered. But Spassky plays very passively here, with bishop to d2, just welcoming knight to g4, threatening that mate in 1, at which point white has two options, h3 or knight takes g4. h3 would weaken the kingside pawn structure a bit, so Spassky goes for knight takes g4, which allows Fischer to now sort of fix his pawn structure with h takes g4. No more doubled pawns, but this does allow Spassky to get his bishop to a nice square, f4, with tempo on the d6 pawn. Queen to f6 defends while attacking the bishop. g3 defends the bishop, but this creates some weakness around the white king. Bishop to g3 would have been better, and if h5 is played, trying to trap that bishop, then knight to b5 would be good, targeting d6. And after black defends with rook to d8, then there's f3, threatening to open up the f-file with threats to the queen. But after this move g3, Fischer develops his bishop to d7, connecting his rooks, threatening some expansion with the move b5. So Spassky shuts that down with a4. b6 now from Fischer is standard procedure for the establishment of a pawn on b5. He'll next play a6 to support it. If he had started with a6, then a5 from white would lock down the b6 square and would capture there if the b pawn was pushed. But here, if white plays a5, black can just bypass with b5. Rook f to e1 from Spassky is a good sensible move, influencing the center. We have a6 from Fischer as planned. Rook to e2 now plans to double the rooks. Spassky is hoping to get in the move e5, which is very thematic for white in the Benoni. b5 is planned. Fischer can now kick the c3 knight backwards at will. We have rook a to d1, adding more support to e5, and now a nice move from Fischer, queen to g6. Now if e5 is played, he'll have queen takes c2, drawing the rook away from the defense of the center, after which he'll win that pawn on e5. So Spassky would love to get his queen off of this diagonal and threaten e5 again, but for the moment, the queen is helping to defend a4, hence his move b3, supporting that pawn with another pawn. Rook to e7 prepares to double up on the important e-file, and now queen to d3 from Spassky, targeting b5. But this does nothing about the pin on the e-pawn, which is why queen to d2 would have been better, facilitating e5. Now, in this position, best for black just might be b4, kicking the knight back, followed by a5, with ideas of bishop to c8, and then bishop to a6. It's what the engine's suggesting, but Fischer instead defends b5 with rook to b8, and again, Spassky should play queen to d2. Maybe he's underestimating how good that move is for him, or maybe he's a bit nervous about Fischer trading on a4 and then infiltrating with his rook. And if you're like me, you might be wondering, if Spassky plays queen to d2, can't Fischer just double his rooks, stopping e5 in its tracks? Actually, no. Check this out. e5 can be played, and after, let's say, b4 and knight to d1, if pawn takes pawn, there's this really cool engine line, bishop to g5, hitting the rook. Black's best response would be f6, but then the bishop goes to e3, hitting c5, which there's actually no way for black to defend. Because if the rook goes to c8, the bishop can capture there. Since after rook takes c5, there's queen takes b4, hitting the rook, which can't be defended. And if it moves, the rook on e7 falls. Pretty crazy, huh? But let me show you what would be better for black. Bishop takes e5, where we have a big trade down on e5, and after the smoke clears, here black has won a pawn, but white can equalize with this move queen to c1, eyeing c5 and threatening to cause problems with queen to g5 check. If the black queen strays too far from the king side, maybe with queen to d8 check next. Of course, black has the potential counter threat if the queen moves off that first rank, which would pin the knight to the king. So in this position, the engine is actually giving double zeros, total equality. Black is up that pawn, but white has the passed pawn, and this black bishop doesn't have a lot of great squares. Knight to e3 is going to be a good move. But getting back to the game, Spassky opted not to play the best move, queen to d2, and instead takes on b5. which prevents Fischer from opening the b file and then infiltrating with the rook. But after the recapture, Fischer is now threatening b4, followed by bishop to b5, which would be very nasty, and a threat which pretty much compels Spassky to play b4. And here he would love Fischer to capture on b4 when knight to a2 is there to round up that pawn, but Fischer goes with the better option, c4, giving himself a passed pawn with tempo on the queen, who now goes to d2. Fischer doubles his rooks. He now has ideas of capturing on c3, followed by winning the e-pawn. Spassky plays rook to e3, which seems to be a waiting move. Spassky is more or less paralyzed without any active plans. Fischer responds with a patient move, h5, defending g4 before cashing in with bishop takes c3, followed by rook takes e4, and you'll see why h5 was useful in a moment. Spassky puts his rook back to e2, clearly without a plan, and Fischer again waits on winning the e-pawn and plays king to h7. So what exactly is he waiting for? Well, let's have a look. If bishop takes c3 here, and queen takes c3, followed by rook takes e4, when all the rooks get traded, ending with queen takes e4, then white could threaten mate in 1 at this point with bishop to h6. There's also the idea of queen to f6 with the potential threat on the back rank. So maybe king to h7 from Bobby Fischer was addressing those moves, but it wasn't really necessary since black has queen to g6 to defend g7, and if queen to f6, looking for queen to d8 check, or queen to g5, black can strike first with queen to b1 check, king to g2, and then bishop to f5, threatening bishop to e4 check. Here, if queen to d8 check, the king can hide on h7, and if queen to g5 check, the bishop is there to block. There's no endless check, and there's no queen takes g4, which is why h5 was a useful move. But whether Fischer saw this exact variation or not, who knows? But Fischer, for whatever reason, wasn't quite ready to go for this yet, which is why in this position he plays king to h7. It wasn't necessary. Bishop takes c3 followed by rook takes e4 was best, but it's not bad since Spassky doesn't have much he can do. We have some back and forth. King goes back to g8, rook back to e2, at which point Fischer decides it's time to go for the material with bishop takes c3. It's the best move, and after queen takes c3 and the big trade down on e4, Spassky decides to threaten that mate in 1 with bishop to h6. Queen to g6 defends while attacking the bishop. It goes to c1, preventing queen to b1 from coming with check, but this move, now played by Fischer, does pin the bishop, hence the move king to f1, headed for e2. Bishop to f5 now from Fischer gets the bishop more active, and he's ready to start harassing the white king, which now goes to e2, unpinning this bishop, but here comes queen to e4 check. Spassky blocks with the queen. We have another check from c2, another block. Is Fischer making any progress here? Oh yeah, he's got queen to b3 now, threatening queen to f3, then queen to h1 with some bishop to d3. This is not going to end well. Spassky tries queen to d4 in a last-ditch attempt to get tricky. If Fischer were to capture on b4, then bishop to b2 and the threat of mate on g7 appears to be sufficient to secure the draw. But Fischer has no interest in taking a pawn. He plays bishop to d3 check, a move which causes Spassky to resign, seeing that if he plays king to e1, then b4 will fall with check. King to d2 would run into a mate in 2, beginning with queen to c2 check, and king to e3 fails to queen to d1, attacking the bishop, which cannot be saved without allowing a forced mate. For example, if bishop to b2, then we have queen to f3 check, king to d2, queen to e2 check, king to c1, and queen to e1 checkmate. So there you have it, an epic milestone for Bobby Fischer, defeating the great Boris Spassky for the very first time in his life, and it's one of the last milestones of his entire chess career, which was basically over after this match. In one of the greatest tragedies in chess history, I mean, can you imagine how many masterpieces Bobby Fischer could have created in the 70s and 80s and beyond if he would have kept playing? And he may not have yet even reached his peak here in 1972, Magnus seems to be playing the best chess of his life, and he's like 4 years older than Fischer was when he quit playing. But anyway, that's it for today. Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing if you like my content and or would like to support the channel, and I will see you next time.